everyone, and welcome to this second day of the Global Justice Program annual conference, which we conduct in conjunction with Academic Stand Against Poverty and Quinnipiac University. And our first guest this morning is Isabel Ortiz. She is Spanish, grew up in Spain, actually from Barcelona, completed her education at the London School of Economics, and has then worked for many years in various international organizations, including prominently the Asian Development Bank in Manila, UNICEF, and the International Labour Organization. She's currently director of the Global Social Justice Program at Joe Stiglitz's Initiative for Policy Dialogue, which is based at Columbia University in New York. So I think given her academic background, as well as her great experience with international organizations, she's particularly well placed to think with us about the problem of structural change, how to achieve it, and how to think about it intelligently. So Isabel, I turn it over to you, and you are co-hostess and can share your screen if you wish.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and for the opportunity to be here with you today. You know, when you first asked me to come here, I was thinking, and you told me a bit of how it was going to be explained. Then I thought, well, most of the program today of the speakers are going to talk about technocratic options or methods to try to achieve change. So I wanted to start by this distinction and then later focus on the issue of the non-technocratic ways, which it will be through social protests. So I'm going to share the screen, if you allow me, and I have actually two documents. Very good. So this is what I was explaining. There will be, in principle, all this conference is mostly thinking about technocratic methods to achieve change. And with that, we will refer things like international conventions or use reports with data that they will compare different countries. So then you will make a government feel bad because they are at the bottom, or use indices, for instance, which is the same process. So if a country appears at the bottom of the index, you know, it generates pressure. It generates pressure to do things better, to move up the ranking. And in that, I wanted to put an example, which I think no other speaker is going to do, and I think is very important, which is international conventions. And then there will be the other type of non-technocratic methods, which it will be protest, and that I present after that. So let's go to the first, an example of a technocratic method. It will be international conventions. Now, this idea, it was developed in the 19th century by activists, unionists, academics, and lawyers. And it was like by the end of the 19th century, they started realizing the issue of labor standards, that more could be done. And the first international convention that we have, to my knowledge, it was precisely to labor standards. It was about the banning the use of white phosphorus in the manufacture of matcha, the harmful health effects. And these that started in a few European countries, it was made an international convention and then approved in 1906 by as many as 41 states or colonies of the time. International standards and conventions can be highly transformative. So what they do is they put a standard which is higher than the common behavior, common policy, and then force all the countries that approve it. They make this country have to adjust their national legislation and the national policies to ensure that their standards of living, or go up to the international level. And we have this has been a major instrument of the United Nations and of the League of Nations. And we have international conventions on a million topics, from elimination of child labor to use of damaging chemicals in factories, issues like maritime signals, traffic signals, or damage human rights, you name it. So the idea is always you set a stand, the higher level needs to be approved by a large number of countries, generally any compared by virtually all countries, and then they have to ratify it to then countries to adapt their legislation to that level. So this is an example of a technocratic method of change. The same as you are going to have issues on indices and country comparisons through data and others. But now I wanted to go to the core that it will be my presentation, which it will be precisely of non-technocratic ways to achieve change. And it will be through protest. And this is mostly the result of a work that we did. It took years to compile, work on global protests from 2006 onwards in 91 countries. And I'm going to share the screen again, and that will be the other presentation. Are you seeing this?
Not yet. Yes.
Okay, now I see.
Yeah, and
very
you
good.
Go into presenter mode at the,
So,
if you can, then it is larger. Yes.
Very good. So this is a study, and it's a free downloadable book published by Palgrave, and this was done by a group of researchers. We started doing that in 2012, and it took us a few years, and we compiled thousands of world protests in 101 countries, covering 93% of the world population. And what we did is trying to understand why people are protesting, what are the trends, what methods are people using, who are protesters opposing to, and what are the achievements. And then when we were reading, we realized that the issue of repression had to be dealt with, because it's a major issue too. You might want structural change, but you might be repressed for trying. So let's go ahead. So the first analysis, the first thing we realized is that there is protests have been increasing significantly over the years since 2006. The first huge amount of protest, it has like two trends. The first one, it comes after 2010, and it comes mostly because of malaise really happening because of the huge austerity cuts that they were happening after the global financial crisis, mostly in developing countries where they were not even aware of that. And then later on, we have a new wave of protest, and mostly driven by failure of democracy and claims for having real democracy. And now what we did, we were analyzing protests, and we classified them in four main groups. These four main groups are economic justice and anti-austerity is the blue line that you see here. Then the other one will be failure of political representation. It's a very wide group. Generally, it means democratic claims. And we're going to see more detail what it means. The third, that will be the orange, reddish line. And then the third group will be civil rights, and it will be from, any type of civil right. And the last one, it will be global justice issues, and is the green line. And as you see, still global issues remain much lower in number of protests than the national and local issues. Okay, so these were the lines. So virtually what you are seeing here is the blue line is the global justice and anti-austerity protest, which is very strong after 2010 because of the many protests. many budget cuts that they were done at the time. And then, as you see, the second, the orange reddish line, it is about claims for real democracy, and this picks up later on. Civil rights also picks up over time. It starts in 2006, ends 2020, and we are updating this now. And then the yellow line, meaning civil rights, and the green line, last one, it will be global justice topics. And these ones, oddly, are, remain kind of stable. If you look at all the number of protests, which is thousands of protests, where we get the main number, the main category will be the failures of democracy and the claims for real democracy. And that's followed. And here you have a different differentiation by high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and low-income countries, plus some global protests that might be on that. So the key topics here are real democracy, corruption, justice, patriotic issues, transparency and accountability, deep government, a feeling of fear of oligarchies, anti-war, anti-military industrial complex, citizens' rebellion, and anti-socialism and communism. So you get a sense. And are you seeing the next one, which is against austerity? Wonderful, thank you. So here the main protests are for jobs, wages, and labor conditions, reforms of public services, protest against corporate influence, deregulation, privatization, inequality, tax, fiscal justice, low living standards, agrarian land reform, pension reforms, housing, and food prices, very relevant for the topic here that is being discussed today also on agrarian issues. Then about civil rights, if you are saying in this slide, the main issue of civil rights will be ethnic, indigenous, or racial justice, freedom of assembly, speech, press, issues of rejecting equal rights to a group. This is very interesting and is number 3. And this is generally a right-wing radical right request, protests that are against migrants, for instance. Then women and girls' rights, labor rights, LGBT sexual rights, immigrant rights, personal freedom, prisoner rights, and religious rights. And last but not least, it will be the cluster of global issues, of which the first one, a number of protests, it will be environmental and climate justice, followed by anti-international financial institutions protests, anti-imperialist protests, anti-free trade, global commons, and anti-G20. Fine. And then, so if you are seeing this other slide that looks black and white, and here what we try to see is who is protesting. And this is a very interesting topic, because traditionally the main protesters have been activists and particularly trade unions. And what we see in recent years is the rise of non-governmental organizations, so CSOs, and grassroots, just simply people going to the street. And that is a big difference from earlier decades. And we find that, older people protest for their pensions, young people protest for a million things, etc. And still we have very active trade unions and social movements and students that have been traditionally there. But it's interesting to see that. And then we see new forms of protest, for instance, like through internet, hackers, and others. But it will be about methods of protest. This period from 2006 onwards, I think, is worth showing that it showed one of the largest protests in history. And we had about 52 protests that had more than 1 million people, which is a lot. And with the problems that we normally have of estimating the numbers of protesters. But most remarkably was in India, which is supposed to have had 250 million people. Protesting about farming and labor issues, and it was a law in 2020, and many others protesting for a number of things. what are the methods of protest? And this is interesting for the topic that we're talking today. The most normal one uses are marches, demonstrations, protest assemblies. And this really is the majority of the methods. And then it's followed by others, and it's interesting. And actually, we presented 200 protest methods, and it's one of the annexes that you can check there. But we have civil disobedience, direct action, internet activism is the fourth most common today, blockades, occupations, formal statements, vandalism and looting, violence is about 20% of the protest. Is much lesser than it appears by described, but is peculiar to be seen. Still is 20%. Strikes, walkouts, educational actions, political stance, legal issues, celebrity endorsements, petitions, noise making, caceroladas, what is done where people go with pots and pans, street theater, music, hunger strikes, boycotts, hacking, mutual aid, whistleblowers, and others. So these are type of protest methods that we recorded, as many as 250. And who did protesters oppose? And that actually is a very interesting question, because the majority of protesters, about 80%, protested national governments. And they are right, because national governments are the legitimate institution that people can protest. And others were opposing the political and economic system, corporations or employers, elites, political parties. Protests also were against the military, the police, the European Union, as many as 10%, local governments, the International Monetary Fund, about 10% of world protests, the financial sector, 9%, the US in general as an empire, 6%, the European Central Bank, social groups, inequality, free trade, and others. China got about 2, nearly 3% of protest. But the main people opposed to governments, and that is really right, because it's something that people may be able to change government policies. And also very interesting to our discussion today, what was achieved. Now, of all the protests that we looked, which were thousands, we estimated about 42% of protests resulted in some kind of demonstrable achievement. But I need to explain that, because demonstrable achievement meant it could have been just a partial objective and not the full objective. But as far as it was some progress, we consider that, and some change, we consider that an achievement. There's a main lesson here is that success was rarely the result of one protest alone, but generally the result of many years protesting. So the more years you protest about a topic, generally this counts. And the more chances of success you have. Very rarely a one-time protest achieves anything. Then let me go back to the issue of the achievements, because sometimes what is achieved, it may be a change, or so you may want I don't know, real structural change, and what you achieve is only a partial thing, even a change of language, at least acknowledgement that that's an issue by the government, and say that they may do something, though still they may not correct to the structural change that you have requested. Okay, and the key lesson here was that the more structural and the more distant the opponents are, the more difficult it is to fight. And this is very relevant, because the next presentation after me is going to be about the G20, but virtually no G20 protest has achieved anything whatsoever. Though people protest, because of course it's an untransparent group that reports to nobody and has no real accountability. But no matter that, it does not happen. So that is important to be seen. So if we look at achievements by the target opponent, so who were the protest opposing to, very interesting is that the most of the achievements happened in China, the country China. And that is interesting too. China is marked by, has a huge amount of internal protest, and mostly are labor issues. People that might be, might have labor issues at unfair, people unfairly paid, or that. And these labor issues are solved in China generally. And despite many problems of proper representation, but they are solved. So that's what counts the largest amount of success achievements by opponent, followed by religious authorities, governments at provincial, local levels, negotiations with employers, not so much corporations, but with employers, governments at national level, political parties, etc. And what you get less at all, it is the G20, free trade, the United States, and these are because people might protest, but they are still there, non-legitimate channels to channel the protest, as a government may be. So that is important as a lesson. And then we also looked at the repression issues because we thought it was important. People do protest, but they get repressed too. And as you can see, the repression in terms of deaths, injuries, violence, arrests, etc., has been increasing over time. And partially because the number of protests increases too. And so it's something to be there. I mean, we described some of the most terrible protests that there have been in terms of injured, deaths, and arrests. And in terms of deaths, it's worth mentioning Kyrgyzstan, Egypt, the occupied territory of Palestine, Kenya, and Iran as the worst cases. Anyway, this is the book. The book also analyzes more things. It has a part that analyzes the rise of populism and radical right protest, the link between inequality and protest, anti-corruption and women's protest, and the links between human rights and the policy demands. And the reality is that if we go back to the topics that people are demonstrating, from women's rights to food security to you name it, actually these are all human rights or development goals fully approved by the United Nations. So reality is people are claiming for things that they are they are right to be complaining about, and governments should act on them when they should listen and act on them when they see that people are requesting things that they are obviously within the scope of development goals and human rights. Okay, so say this, I finished the presentation. The sharing has been stopped, isn't it? And then perhaps there's some questions and answers.
Yeah, there will certainly be questions and answers. Maybe I can start the discussion with this question. What I find very difficult in thinking about protests is the assessment of the actual effects. And you had a slide in there where you talk about whether there was some sort of response or some sort of positive reaction, something was achieved. But really what we are interested in is the larger picture in terms of temporal frame, right? We are not just interested in whether, for example, some candy was thrown at protesters so that they got a little something to keep them quiet and to maybe dissipate the protest. But in the long run, it could happen that the establishment becomes much more repressive and rolls back whatever little concessions they made and arm themselves much better to resist the next kind of protest. So is there any way, I mean, this is maybe just too hard to think about, for anybody, but is there any way in which you have tried to assess what the longer term implications are, and in particular, how the people that are getting protested against, in particular national governments, how they kind of improve their long-term strategy to make protest irrelevant.
Look, this has been a first study on the topic of protest. The achievements was one of the aspects. It was not the only aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did is the first analysis, and they are obviously major risk, and it's not the same to protest in a democratic country where there are civil liberties and with governments might be more responsive, and as you're saying, on a more authoritarian country where it might lead to later repression and and very limited response. So at the moment we don't have quantify numbers of that, and it would be difficult. That's the reason actually we didn't do it. We just gave a bit of a taste of what it is, and more analysis will be needed. It's complex to understand why some protests are successful and why others are not. The clear message is it takes time. One protest, it has, to my knowledge, never achieved things. You require a number of protests over a number of years, and that's one. And the second, you do need to have a clear opponent with a feasible demand. Meaning, if you do have the G20, which there has no legitimate, as we mentioned, no legitimate way that a citizen in I don't know, in a non-G20 country, then you might protest, but there's nothing you can do there. And that's why democracy does matter, and the channels do matter. So still protest that go against government policies or demanding government policies, it can make it happen. Very often, I mean, there's a combination these are all activist tools. So going back to the issue of technocratic tools and protest, very often activists or both, they use both methods. They will have some intelligent analysis in the back saying why this happens and comparing countries and things like that. And still people will protest. So the mix, I would think it will be most effective.
Any other thoughts from others? So good. So maybe I continue my line of questioning a little bit. What worries me in regard to protest is co-optation. That people, the government will try to respond to protests intelligently. They will try to say, look, we agree with you in some ways. We are on your side. We are trying to solve these problems. We are doing the best we can. And in a way sort of undermine the thrust of the protest, and maybe even basically co-opt the protesters and give them something that is not really meaningful change, sort of fob them off with something that is less substantial and say, here, this shows our goodwill. It shows that we are trying to address the concerns that you have, and essentially dissipate the protest, weaken the protest, and delay, because, as you said, protest to be successful, it has to be sustained over a long period. And if protesters are told to defer, if the government says we are already working on this, or if some of the protesters defect because they feel that their concerns will in due course be addressed, then that can weaken the movement to the point where it is really no longer effective and cannot see through its main goals.
Completely. You're completely right. And let's pick, for instance, large protests like the Arab Spring. Let's pick it in, for instance, in Egypt. So they did achieve they had major achievements. Governments went down, politicians went down, but so yet they did not get the demands. Still, Egyptians don't have good quality water, social services as they claimed, education, health, quality health, etc., and good social protection for people. So these demands, they were not done, though they had major achievements and governments went down. And there was a democratic thing at the beginning. And yes, it is true, it can happen. And then in other cases, however, it did not happen. I will think that probably, you know, the democratic orientation of people and the country does have an impact. For instance, let's pick another very successful case, which it was Iceland. In Iceland, at the time, both Greece and Iceland were requested to pay back debt. And at the time of after the global financial crisis, and it was a debt incurred by the financial sector mostly, and that citizens had no say, and because the financial sector had been badly deregulated in earlier years. And then this politician actually did call for a referendum and ask the population if would you like. There were demonstrations all over before that, and people with the pans, complaining and all that. And then there was a referendum done, and they say, okay, so do you want to pay back this debt, which it was mostly to Dutch and English banks, if I'm not wrong, and leave the country, very indebted and with austerity cuts for the next decades to come, like Greece, or you prefer not to pay and then go into, default and bad economic consequences as they were threatened. And it was the whole population gave a resounding no. They did not want to pay back foreign banks because of the bad regulation done by a previous government. And so this protest achieved that motive. And not only that, the protest continued after that because people were furious about the deregulating finance process. So actually politicians were eventually, after so many protests, were sent to be judged and went to prison, actually. And interestingly, Iceland did not pay back the debt. And however, it was doing very well after a couple of years. And however, Greece, who followed orthodoxy and paid fully back, or remains paying to mostly German and European banks, actually, despite the protest, where it did not have an impact there. Then, however, they are in a much worse situation today. And so, protests sometimes achieve objectives, sometimes they don't. The quality of the democracy probably does matter.
Yeah. And I agree with you on the Iceland case. We've had experts from Iceland actually in my seminar several times, and we discussed that case in great detail. And that helped that some of the government people were personally corrupt, that, of course, greatly weakened their position. But I'm thinking of the largest protests that you mentioned, the one in India against the 3 farm bills, right? 250 million people protesting, extremely powerful protests. The Modi government had to withdraw those farm bills, and so there was an immediate success. But of course, the Modi government is working hard to restore the bills in a different form and to get on through the back door what they couldn't reach through the front door. And so in a way, you can say that if you look at it in the larger frame, the protest was at best partially successful.
Correct. We did not enter into partial or full achievement. And actually, we just noted that there was some achievement. Okay. And to properly evaluate that, you will need proper evaluations over each case, which is not the case. This is a quick exercise to see, to get the trends and to see,
And there seems to be sort of a tension between 2 different things. On the one hand, in order to be successful in protesting, one needs really a strategy. One needs to be very well organized, and that favors hierarchies, sort of strategy, common leadership, and so on. But on the other hand, of course, protesters are intrinsically grassroots. They don't want to be organized like an army. They want to be free to protest one day and maybe not protest the next day, or to choose the issues that they want particularly to care about and to highlight. And so it could be that there is, in the very nature of the protesting mind, sort of the rebel in Camus' phrase, there is something that makes it harder for protesters to be well organized enough and to have the long, well-structured, well-planned strategy that could favor their success, that could allow them to see it through.
Indeed. But actually, if you look at who participates, the reality is that the grassroots protests were in a low moment. Like in year 2006, when we started saying, and the numbers of grassroots participated increased massively over the years. I guess because things are becoming more difficult for a number of reasons. These austerity cuts, the cost of crisis, the cost of living crisis, etc. So people become cuts on pensions and social benefits, etc. So then people become more aware, and they just protest without having been organized. Still, the big achievements relate to organization, relate to the trade unions and to civil society organizations that are organized and are very often with think tanks in the back that they are feeding them, with the intel on what are the right policies, feasible requests, etc.
Matteo?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. And my question, and let me know if you cannot hear me. My microphone sometimes is a bit like shaky. So my question goes into exactly this direction that you just went to now, and I wanted to ask, like, do you have like numbers on how many protests are actually coming out of kind of grassroots or loose movements or spontaneous movements, and how many actually are organized? So that's the first question. And the second question, do you as well have numbers or that show how many social society, social or movement or groups are being created after spontaneous protests? So is there like, I think that's somewhat the success as well, right? Because they can become active, politically active. So is there as well research on this?
Yes, it is. I don't know. These are very good questions, and I don't know the numbers by heart. You can download the book for free and check them there in terms of the participants, the protesters. However, what you don't have there, if it's who originates, because the reality, many issues are long-standing, and because of the classification method itself, so you put women issues, women-related topics, these are long-standing issues. Generally, this is a mix of organized organizations, meaning trade unions and activists and civil society organizations, and just a spontaneous movement of people. Time to time, you get just a spontaneous movement of people. That was the case of the food riots, for instance, that we saw across Africa and Middle East and a number of countries. And there was no particular organization of that. They were linked to the cost of living crisis. The more you go to a kind of very basic issue like that, the more you are going to have riots. Simply not organized. But soon after, even after they start, then you get unions coming also and saying, yes, because we have been saying for long that we need higher wages, and which is the right, is correct. It's either the income you receive or the prices, so it's generally a mix of both.
But like new organizations evolving out of like spontaneous movements, or is it mostly like existing movements and then take on these problems as theirs?
Yes, that was your second question. You're right. Yes, there's many new organizations that get formed after protests start, because it creates this sense of solidarity between protesters, and they start defining the issues that perhaps before they just went to the street because, I don't know, pensions were low, and then you get all people going to the streets, and then they suddenly decide, so let's get together and form a group. There were many done, particularly in I mean, middle and higher income economies after the big austerity cuts of after the financial crisis, and you do get from the real democracy type of groups, neighbor groups, many, and many get dissolved, and they are short-lived too, because difficult to sustain a movement, and particularly as they're not particularly financed, and that will be another topic of research which I did not do, but we did not do, but if it just counts with voluntary time of people, generally it takes it's much more difficult to sustain than not organizations that do have some financing mechanism like trade unions or civil society organizations that are there. They have a structure and financing that can sustain the fight over time.
On that question of limited time, to what extent, in your experience, are protest movements in competition with each other? So you might say there's only a limited amount of time and energy that anybody can invest in protest. And so if one protest movement attracts a person's resources, then other protest movements can no longer count on those same resources. So in a way, they are competing with each other. You might say, to take the US example, that Black Lives Matter competed with the Me Too movement, right? That they were in a way, of course, aligned. They were objecting to some of the same issues, but they were also to some extent competing for attention, competing for resources, competing for numbers that would show up at demonstrations and so on. Second to that, is there a way in which one can solve that problem by greater unity, by sort of saying we should, instead of having too many protest movements that are compartmentalized by issue, we should try to create a larger movement that is, let's say, prioritizing one issue in a certain period of time, and then brings the full strength of the movement to bear on another issue at a later time.
Very much so, what you were saying. Though we did not do interviews to specific movements or anything, but meaning to individuals about the use of time. But yes, you can see what you are saying. Actually, one of the trends at the moment is what is called the omnibus protest. So now what happens, people go and protest about many things at the same time, simply because, as you say, there is perception that the system itself is just broken and is not really working. So many topics are put at the same time. Even you might do a protest because of an issue, but still these people there that come with the big notes and putting many others there that are very relevant to the issue too, but might not be core. And so the omnibus protest is what generally people refer to as the term. And yes, it is indeed happening for the reasons that you point.
Okay. Any other questions? Comments? Yeah, Christian?
One of my concerns about protest movements is the distinguishing between what is truly an indigenous protest movement and to what extent it is supported by external forces that have their own agendas. I mean, I give you a couple of examples. We were talking earlier about the Sikh farmers movement in India. And what is not very well known is that it was substantially funded and promoted by the Sikh community in Canada, which is very rich, a lot of resources, and they were providing considerable financial and other means of support. And perhaps, the recent incident about a Sikh leader being assassinated by Indian intelligence groups could have been a reaction to that situation. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking aloud with you. Another example I can give is the Maidan movement in Ukraine in 2014, which was definitely funded by outside sources, not necessarily. It was certainly a local movement, but had tremendous outside support, which ended up in a coup d'etat in 2014 and a major change in geopolitics. I refer also to the protest movements after the Arab Spring in Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood was overthrown, which also had a lot of, the agitation was supported by outside forces, which resulted in al-Sisi coming in as the new president of Egypt with support from the US and Israeli groups. So my question really relates to how do we really ensure that the protest movements retain their authenticity and their indigenous and their natural character without, and distinguish that from outside forces which then agitate and stimulate and create even more disruptive movements than were originally intended? Is there a balance here that can be achieved?
I hear you. It's a very, very good comment. It is difficult to address because at the moment we know that even intelligence services are moving towards disruptive activities, promoting social instability. Let me put the typical example used are the troll farms that the Russia has. And, when they see a friction in a society, very often they start disseminating disinformation and with, fake videos, you name it. Now, this interference is probably going to be always. So it was in the past, and it's going to be probably even more in the future. However, it does not, because the interference exists, it does not necessarily mean that the cause is wrong. That people protest because they may be asking for whatever, they may be asking, maybe fully legitimate. But you're still going to, because of the freedom of the internet and things like that, you're going to have, and the free flow of capital between countries, you're going to have things like that everywhere. So it is happening, and it's probably going to happen even more in the future. But still, the causes might be fully legitimate.
No, I realize that, but if you look at the example of the Foundation for Democracies, which is a US group that puts on its website all the protest movements and the anti-government movements that may not be consistent with the ideology of the US and the Western collective West, it does raise the question as to whether we are playing too overt a role in stimulating protest movements to foment and support our own agendas. And how one distinguishes between that and authentic movements has always troubled me. I wonder if you can comment on the Foundation for Democracies. And, often after a major disruption has taken place in a foreign country, they remove from their website the support they have provided to those groups because they don't want people to know. But they're open about it. And that's my worry.
Yes, the purpose of the study is to look at trends, and we refuse to analyze a specific case because of, it is the value of the study is the genetic, the aggregates that you get, not to stop in just one case. Still, as meant, protests are complex and achievements, results are complex, but no matter that, the key fact is looking at them, as an aggregate, and at least for a study, and see if they were achieving things.
So, and we are very grateful that you came, and thank you very much for your presentation and discussion. And we will post it and hopefully get many more views from interested people on this very interesting topic.
Thanks to you and to everybody for the interest and for the questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Isabel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.